Security is one of the biggest budget items of any Olympic Games, if not the biggest. Paris 2024, in a little over 11 weeks' time, is not expected to be any different. International news cycles continue to be dominated by the wars in Gaza and Ukraine. And the focus on Russia and Israel will also be pronounced during the Olympics. 4 days after the flame went out at the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics, Russia invaded Ukraine and was suspended by the IOC. In Paris, athletes from Russia will compete as neutrals without a flag or anthem, but they must provide evidence they have not fought in or supported the war in Ukraine. Lobby groups supporting Gaza specifically and Palestine generally have asked why the same regulations are not applied to athletes from Israel as the bombardment in Gaza continues, with the death toll standing at around 35,000. That's around 35 times the number of Israelis who died in the horrific Hamas terrorist attacks on October 7. Not to mention the desecration of villages, hospitals and schools, and the choking of access points, starving the Palestinians of food and water. I was discussing war, politics and the Olympics with author and historian Harry Blutstein for my weekly podcast, The Sports Ambassador. He's written books like The Games of Discontent and Cold War Games.
Getting back to the Palestinian situation, this is involving, I can't imagine any athlete coming to Paris, Palestinian, who hasn't lost a member of their family, because, the death toll is enormous. It's unbelievable.
Including many athletes.
I didn't know that. Well, even more so. And then, of course, you've got the very interesting situation that all Israelis are conscripted into the army. Have Israeli athletes actually gone into Gaza? And then I think you're in an area that's quite different, that they're not representatives of peace. They've actually been involved in a very, very violent and unequal confrontation, resulting in an enormous number of deaths. So, it's not that simple.
No, it's not. It's never simple. Do you think, in the way the Russians have had to prove, the Russians that will be competing in Paris as independent athletes, and they've had to prove that they haven't been part of the military and the invasion of Ukraine, do you think the same rules should apply to Israel?
Totally. I hadn't thought about that. But following through my logic before, yes, because, these people may well have killed Palestinians.
Despite the desire to do so, it is absolutely impossible to separate politics from big sporting events like the Olympic Games or the FIFA World Cup, even though the Olympics was established as part of a peace movement. This week at the United Nations, there was an overwhelming vote of support for Palestine to be given more recognition and more rights, with the potential to have it one day being granted full membership at the global body. 143 nations voted in favour, 9 against, and 25 abstained. Here's just a part of what the Australian ambassador to the UN, James Larson, had to say in his speech.
And I now invite a distinguished representative of Australia to take the floor.
I thank you, Mr. President. Australia welcomes this resolution's unwavering support for the two-state solution of Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security within recognised borders. This is a clear rejection of the goals and methods of Hamas. A two-state solution, Israel and Palestine, is the opposite of what Hamas wants. We condemn Hamas' terrorist attack on Israel and call for the immediate release of all hostages. Australia has long believed a two-state solution offers the only hope for breaking the endless cycle of violence and achieving lasting peace.
One of the biggest teams in Paris will undoubtedly be the Australian Olympic team, with upwards of 450 athletes. After the annual general meeting of the Australian Olympic Committee last weekend in Sydney, I asked the President, Ian Chesterman, and the CEO, Ian Carroll, how prepared the Australian athletes were for both the security prospect around Paris 2024 and any questions they might be asked or the athletes might be asked.
Any questions?
I've got a question with regard to Paris. You mentioned that security may be an issue. They're on top of that. That the Olympic movement is a peace movement, essentially. Have you had any briefing sessions with the Australian athletes about that, in case they are asked things like Ukraine, Russia, Gaza, Israel, doping, etc.?
I'll ask Matt to respond to that, because he's working more closely with the team operations.
The answer to your question there, Tracy, is yes, we do provide briefing sessions to athletes on those sorts of all those issues, and including the security as well. We have our own security consultant who works very closely with the Australian Federal Police, who will also have a liaison officer with the team, and also with their counterparts, the Five Eyes, the USA, Canada, New Zealand and GB. So we're very closely connected. We'll also be providing briefings to family and friends, both those who are staying here and those who are going to the games, to make sure that family and friends aren't anxious, because that anxiety can often obviously affect the performance of athletes, so we don't want that to happen either. So no, we're spending a lot of time. We have sub-sites and sub-villages as well, so we've mapped out those, including the ones in Tahiti, through our security consultants, so that I'm sure the French police, not sure, I'm positive the French security service will do everything to protect the games and the athletes at the games and the people attending the games, and we will do our bit looking after our team.
One of Australia's former gold medal winning teams at the Olympics is the women's water polo team. The coach of the current squad, named for Paris recently, is Bec Rippon. She's a two-time Olympian herself. She was an assistant coach in Tokyo 2020, and now she's got the top job for Paris 2024. I caught up with her at the naming of the team at the Dawn Fraser Balmain Baths in Sydney, named after one of Australia's other Olympic legends. And isn't that the greatest thing about the Olympic Games, is that like the whole world does come.
Yeah.
Not everyone sees things the same way,
No.
but for that 2 weeks, it's okay. And so in that respect, what do you think when people talk about things like, that nation should be suspended or that team shouldn't come? Well, as an athlete and an international world athlete, what do you think about those?
I mean, they're big questions, and I'm not 100% sure where I stand on every single thing, but I do believe that it's not always the individual athlete's decision of what's going on in the world and what they support and what they don't. Again, we've all got our voice in how we use it. So I think as an athlete competing, you want to compete against the best, but at the same time, there's probably things bigger than what we know and what we understand, and sometimes we just have to accept what it is. So for me, as an athlete and with this team, it's who's there, who do we have to compete against, and go and do our best against them.
National flags have become such strong symbols at any major sporting event. It's one of the reasons why it is so hard to separate the politics from the sport. On the one hand, you've got athletes being asked to park their politics at the door and to not bring in any kind of demonstration, although they are allowed to do so if they are off the field of play. On the other hand, you've got governments, you've got corporate groups, you've got lobby groups, you've got sponsors, all hoping to use the platform that these mega events provide to push whatever message they have that they feel is most important to tell the world. So this is one of the ongoing difficulties that the Olympic Games will face. If you want to hear all of those interviews in full, you can do so on the weekly Sports Ambassador podcast. I'm Tracy Holmes. See you next time.